Welcome to Retail Management, BUS302, Week 7, Lecture Number 1. This week we're going to be talking specifically about merchandise management, which in retail, retail management, you should probably expect that this is a rather important topic to think about. In some of our specific learning outcomes, we're going to talk about the difference between managing the merchandise management process for basic and fashion merchandise, talk about predicting sales, talk about how do we determine appropriate inventory levels. We'll talk about also merchandise control systems, ways to evaluate our management decisions that we've made. We'll also explain and look at issues that we have when we're trying to source various products or various merchandise, either national brands or store brands. Talk about negotiating with vendors and thinking a little bit about how we develop those strategic relationships. Of course, there's always ethical and legal, ethical, and social responsibility issues when we are talking about managing in the retail environment. So we'll also look at some of those issues as well. So when we really start talking about merchandise management, just to kind of give you the overview, we have, as a retailer, we have to buy merchandise for our organization. And so what we'll probably do is break down our merchandise into various groups of, various areas, things like maybe grocery, hard lines, soft lines, so on and so forth. And we will household goods, those types of things. So we have groups, and those groups are going to be managed and overseen by a general merchandise manager or a buyer of some sort, right? We'll have somebody that's overseeing that area. Within the group, you're going to have various departments. And so you'll have these divisional or department merchandise managers who are going to really focus on one specific area. So within like a hard lines group, you might have, say, sporting goods and electronics. And so you'll have a manager for sporting goods and then a merchant, somebody for electronics, right? We'll classify we'll have different classifications for our within our department. We'll break that down even further. And eventually we get down to a SKU or a stock keeping unit, a SKU, that stock keeping unit, which is a specific inventory item. Now, when we start talking about how do we manage this, right, we have this category, right, where the category, you've got one buyer or one category manager, something like a grocery store, right? So one of the reasons that you're going to have a category manager or maybe a category captain within a very broad area is it helps really increase your profits. It helps focus people's attention on one specific area. And it really does make things easier. So you really focus on one area as a buyer or manager in these categories or divisions areas, right? So you want to definitely plan out a very specific thing. Now, how do you evaluate? So when you start thinking about, okay, how's one category doing or how's one area doing? One of the things that you want to look at is the general merchandise return on investment. Now, when we talk about the gross margin return on investment. So when we talk about the GM ROI, right, we're going to take the gross margin percentage, which is that gross margin. So we'll take our sales minus our cost of goods and divide it by our net sales. So, right, so it gives us that gross margin percentage. And then we will do the sales to stock ratio, which is net sales divided by our average inventory at cost. Okay. You multiply those two together, and that would give us your gross margin times divided by your average inventory. So this would be how we would rate or evaluate our performance. So we want this number to be higher, right? We want a higher gross margin percentage than our return on investment than lower. So the higher that we get, the better off that will be. So this is one way that we could use to evaluate our merchandise management performance. So a specific area, right? So we're going to use fresh baked bread, right? So we've got bread, we've got the sales, the gross margin, actual inventory, and then we've got some canned food. And as we go through, we do these calculations, right? So the gross margin divided by average inventory for fresh baked breads, 200%. We have 200% for the gourmet canned food as well, right? So we'd say that's pretty good for our inventory. Well, I'd say it's really good for our inventory areas. But this is how you would calculate that, and that's what this would look like. So this would be one way to evaluate merchandise management in a specific area. Another would be measuring your sales to stock ratio, right? So this is done, I would say, they say typically on an annual basis. I would say probably on a quarterly basis more than, not so much in an annual. It is done annually, but also on a quarterly, right? So what you want to do is you want to take the number of months, the inventory level at the end of each day, and divide by 365. So that's going to be the most accurate, is where you take all the dates within a year, right? And then divide that by 365. But you can also do end of month inventories, right? Like we've done here. So let's say we have January, February, March, 22, 35, 38,000. We total those to get 93,000. We get the average end of month inventory, 31,000. That's kind of the shorthand, because, you don't want to do, it'd be like 90 days. So rather than do 90 end of inventory days, you do the end of month inventory. That's kind of an easier way to do that average inventory calculation. And so what we would do then is measure the sales to stock. So, right, and when we talked about that, the sales to stock, the net sales divided by your average inventory. So we take that just like we did here. So that would be a way we could do that. So ways that we improve this is we would one way to improve your GMROI, right, is to improve your inventory turnover. So you can reduce the amount of inventory that you have, so you have better inventory sell-through, or you can increase your sales, or you can reduce and how do you do that? Well, you can either reduce the number of products, right, the number of SKUs, or you can reduce the amount of backup, what you have in the back room, right? Maybe, and if you do that, you're going to have to buy merchandise more often, smaller quantities, right? Increase your sales, but don't increase your inventory, type of thing. You could also do that. So another thing you could do to improve this ratio is to increase your price, find a better deal, negotiate better pricing with your vendors to reduce your cost of goods sold, or don't discount your product as much. So these are ways that you can improve those areas. Okay. Now, when we start looking at that, that's how you evaluate some of your decisions and everything else. You got to think, how are we going to plan this, right? So we know how we're going to evaluate, but now let's think, all right, what products am I going to buy and everything else? So understanding this whole system, though, you have to understand you have different types of merchandise: staple merchandise, basic merchandise, things that you're going to continually replenish, fashion, and seasonal. So the fashion and seasonal, those tend to come in and out. So you want smaller amounts. Staple merchandise, things that you're going to have on hand all the time, or also your basic merchandise. You're going to constantly, you might keep more of a back stock because you know that's going to be there forever. Continuous replenishment, that's the same thing. All right. So as you go through, how do you plan and how do you develop this? Well, you forecast the category sales. So you come up with a sales for, let's say, sporting goods. Figure out what kind of assortment you want, right? Determine the inventory levels. Develop your plan, right? Allocate the merchandise for the store. Then you're going to buy your merchandise and evaluate the performance. So this is the process that you go through. So you figure out how much you're going to sell, do the assortment, and everything else. Now, when you forecast staple merchandise, things that you're going to have forever, things that you are always collecting, always going to be selling, as staple merchandise, the easiest thing to do is just use your historical sales, right? Look back over the last 12, 14, 24 months, whatever it is, right? And say, okay, this is what we do on average. You can look for seasonality, for things like weather conditions, everything else, make some adjustments, right? But that forecast will is probably pretty stable. So stick with that, and that would be what you're going to sell. So make those adjustments, right? You can control for store opening and closing times, special promotions, where you place it, but you can't control for things like a pandemic. So you have to be aware of those things, right? You got to think about, okay, what's going on that might just blow up in my face? So that's where you have to make some your historical sales might not always be the best. So the reason I mentioned the pandemic, think about during the pandemic, all the stores that had no toilet paper or paper towels or whatever it was, is because that was uncontrollable. They had no idea what was going to go on. So that kind of threw everything off, all that planning area. Now, when we talk about fashion merchandise or seasonal merchandise, you can start with previous sales data, but you're going to, since it is fashion or it's seasonal, you are going to have to do a little bit more marketing research, look to internet and social media, try to talk to people, maybe use some focus groups, use some data analytics, talk to your vendors. This is going to be a lot harder to forecast because you just don't know whether or not it's going to, whatever that fashion item is, if it's going to, if that, whatever, and normally we talk fashion, we're thinking clothing, if whatever it is going to take off, right? If it's a specific print or color, something like that. So you want to, it's a little harder to do that, talk to the vendors and things like that, get a little bit more in-depth help on those. Now, the last thing is when you're talking about a service retailer, right? You think about when you're trying to figure out your sales ends for service. Now, you have to remember that whatever you have at the end of the day with a service person, it's gone. It's not going to come. You're never going to get it back. So your sales, right, your opportunity ends. It's end of day, not end of season. For example, empty seats on an airplane. Once that plane takes off, you can't sell any more seats, right? Or, you know what I mean? Any empty seat is always going to be empty. So how do you do that? You're going to use reservations, try appointments, do advanced tickets, right? And then you'll just have to deal with some things like cancellation and those things. So that's part of your merchandise planning and forecasting in those situations. You do your best, but you know you're going to have problems. This is why airlines will sometimes sell 110% of the seats, because they know that some people are going to cancel and things like that. All right, so that gets us to the end of this first video in week 7, and we'll pick up in video number 2.